What's up, guys? My girlfriend made something that smells amazing. I have no idea what it is, but anyways, another video about inflation today. It's gonna be interesting to see CINBC. No, I'm saying CINBC, CNBC International's take on how inflation works. As I mentioned in previous videos, inflation is important when it comes to global markets because it gives us an idea on what the Fed or the central bank for that country is going to do. And I mainly focus on U.S. markets, but there are other markets that you can look at as well, such as Japan. I know that one of the analysts that I follow, Russia, U.S., and South Korea currently are having some inflationary issues. Well, pretty much globally we are, but them specifically, they're looking to potentially raise rates. And as you may or may not have noticed, since I started talking about inflation, there have been talks about the Fed potentially, well, not potentially, like they're pretty guaranteed to have 3 rate hikes. We'll see if they do anything more than 3 rate hikes this year. But anyways, let's jump into the video.
I wondered how your grandparents bought a house with what would barely be enough to get a used car today. Yes, the prices for things are constantly going up, and the main reason for this is inflation.
Here's a fun fact for you. If you had bought, say, a pint of milk in the UK in 1960, it would have cost you 3 pence. Today, that would cost you 50 pence.
3 pence? Like, can we buy anything with 3 pence today?
Probably not.
With unemployment remaining high, sales and production both remaining low. And yet the government are still wedded to their policy of bringing inflation down.
Inflation remains steady at 2.3% last month.
Everyone is talking about inflation, which is having a real-life impact on all of our wallets right now.
So why does this economic phenomenon happen, and is it a good or a bad thing? Inflation is the rate of increase in the price of goods and services over a period of time. Hello, Jumana.
Hey, Timo.
This is Jumana Bersechi, a CNBC anchor and our resident monetary policy and economics whiz. So let's talk about inflation.
Why don't we go back to the basics?
Let's do it.
Traditional economics would dictate that there are 2 main causes for inflation. There is demand pull inflation and cost push inflation.
Cost push inflation happens when business expenses increase, and these extra costs are passed on to their customers.
So with cost push inflation, what happens is that the price of your inputs or your raw materials goes up over time. And that could be because of anticipated events or unanticipated events, like, say, a natural disaster. A good example of that would be, say, what has happened to many of the world's economies.
I kind of want to just give a brief example on cost push. Now, it doesn't, you probably won't see it yet, but I think it was sometime around July. I would say like July, August, sometime around there. There was a blizzard in Brazil, which caused a lot of the cocoa beans, not cocoa beans, coffee beans to get frozen. So that made coffee bean futures spike up in price. Now that's kind of an idea of cost push due to an event that was uncontrollable. And then how we can go into something that might help with that is saying that, let's say you're a coffee manufacturer and you need to buy coffee beans. And when you're buying those coffee beans, because of the fact that there are less coffee beans, so this is supply and demand, so there are less coffee beans that that can go around, so that makes the price go up. So there's more demand for a thing and there's less supply. So that means that you can raise prices on that. From that perspective, let's say that since there's less coffee beans available for that manufacturer, so they can break even and at least stay profitable to pay their employees, to pay for equipment, you know, just to stay in the black, not to go red or have to take out a whole bunch of debt, they have to raise prices on their products. So since they're manufacturing coffee, they're gonna have to raise coffee prices. And what that ends up doing is making coffee more expensive for the consumer. So when you go to the store, you're going to have to buy, well, you don't have to buy it, but when you go to the store to buy coffee, you might notice that it's a little bit more expensive. Or sometimes what they'll do is they'll lessen the quantity and keep the price the same. So you might normally get 10 ounces of coffee. I don't know how the ounces and all that stuff work. I don't drink coffee. But you might get 10 ounces of coffee normally for, let's just say, $2. But then this time you might get, it's going to still stay the same at $2, but instead you only get 8 ounces of coffee. So that's kind of an example of cost push, but yeah.
Coming out of lockdown. And on the back of that, we've seen a lot of supply chain bottlenecks. We've seen a rise in shipping costs. We've seen in certain areas a labor shortage. And because most of those inputs will go into the price of manufacturing, inevitably that has led to higher costs.
Then there is demand pull inflation, which is when the demand for goods and services outpaces supply. And when the economy is strong.
Demand pull is probably a better reflection of what happens when the economy is very close to full capacity.
We'll go back. My bad, guys. Think out.
Inflation, which is when the demand for goods and services outpaces supply. This tends to happen when the economy is strong.
Demand pull is probably a better reflection of what happens when the economy is very close to full capacity. In the case of a very well-functioning economy, people may feel that they have more disposable income to spend, and therefore demand for goods and services may go up. And if companies are operating at full capacity, they won't be able to increase their production to keep up with that demand, so that could also be inflationary.
Some economists also see increasing money supply as another major cause of inflation.
Around the 70s.
So let's look back at 2020 when President Trump at the time decided that we need to stimulate the economy because people weren't going to be going to work for a month or two. It started out that way, or 2 weeks or whatever. And you have to print a lot of money to give money to people. So that causes inflation. Now, it might not cause crazy inflation, but it does cause inflation because you have to, you're not, money, you can print money out of air, but money isn't free. So people get the $600 a week in unemployment. I think it was $1,200 for everybody. I can't remember. It was like $1,200 and it was like $600 a week for unemployment or something. And what happens is people have disposable income because some people maybe don't make $600 a week normally from their job. Maybe they made $300 a week, so they have a little bit more disposable income. So that is what caused asset prices to also rise because instead of people saving money, the government is giving you money, so you're not really worried too much about, savings. So you buy laptops, you buy Nikes, iPhones, you buy all these things, and all that does is make the earnings for those companies go up in value, which also helps us as investors decide that everything's going good, earnings are good, let's continue to buy stocks. So people spending money that probably need it more in the long run than they think they do helps us as investors make more money because the asset prices are going to rise in value. But anyways, I'm kind of getting deep into it, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how this inflation is caused and why it's both a good thing and a bad thing. So let's see what else they say in the video and we'll react to that.
a new type of view came to the forefront, and that was posited by famous economist Milton Friedman. And his view, and he actually said this, is that inflation primarily and everywhere is a monetary phenomenon.
So is Milton Friedman's theory always right, that increased money supply leads to an increase in
You're putting
prices?
me on the spot, Timo. I mean, try to get a couple of economists to agree on anything. It's really difficult. Keynesian economics is all about what governments do. Milton Friedman is saying, well, this is actually the domain of central banks. And if you look at the response to the great financial crisis, to the pandemic, what central banks have done globally, at least advanced economies, has contributed to an increase in the amount of money supply that's available. And so many of the people who believe in the Milton Friedman monetary theory of inflation suspect that because there has been such an expansion of money supply, eventually that is going to be extremely inflationary. But Timo, we're not seeing it. And so the question is why? So let me give you an example. If I walked into this...
Now, we are seeing it. A lot of people think that just because you're printing money today that you're going to see the effects of inflation tomorrow. I think on average it takes about 18 months for you to actually see the effects of inflation. So we're starting to see that a little bit more today. Now, this video came out in August or September of 2021. It is now late January 2022. You see inflation. You'll start to see it a lot more throughout the year. Economics is weird. Like, people think that just because we printed money in 2020 that you're going to see the effects happen. Well, it was March 2020. You're going to see the effects happen super quickly, but that's not always the issue. I mean, you're going to see these effects later on. So gas prices is a little bit different. Gas, you start to see that fluctuate a lot more. But when it comes to this, like commodity prices, the commodity prices, sometimes these things sit, sometimes they take a little bit of time, but a majority of the time you're going to see it happen a little later on than just super quickly. Now, I know inflation for 2021 was like 7 something percent. I'm not super good with numbers, but anyways, I am good with numbers, but I don't remember every single like decimal point. But I think real inflation was like 14-15%. Everybody kind of has their own view on like interpretation of which inflation numbers we're looking at. But anyways, I'm kind of going super in depth. We don't need to do, they might explain this later in the video. I've been doing that a lot lately. So let's see what they say going forward.
This room, let's say, with a bag of cash, and I just put it on the floor, but no one picked it up and no one did anything with it. Its impact on inflation would be nil, right? Because it's just sitting there. What if we told everyone at CNBC that there's a bag of cash sitting on the floor waiting to be picked up? You'd probably get a stampede of people taking the bills out, going down to Costa, buying coffees, buying croissants, and spending on goods and services. In that situation, the pile of cash that I brought into the room actually is inflationary because it's leading to more transactions. So the missing link right now is that the number, or what we call the velocity of transactions, has actually dropped quite a lot. In order for this money supply to be inflationary, you need to see the transaction levels or that velocity of money go up again.
Got it. Wow. That was like a light bulb moment. I feel like I really get it now.
Great. I don't have a bag of cash though.
Oh, damn it, Jemana, I'm leaving.
The most widely used measure of inflation is an economic indicator called the Consumer Price Index. It's calculated by measuring the percentage change in the price of a basket of selected goods and services a typical household uses.
So to kind of go on to Consumer Price Index, when you're trading and you're looking at like news announcements, they'll call it CPI. CPI data, and you'll see it for different currencies, because every country is going to have different CPI numbers because they're going to consistently change those interest rates, or they might, threaten to change interest rates and they're not, but, It is what it is. So CPI is consumer price index. So you'll see a lot more stuff referred to as CPI rather than consumer price index.
Over a period of time, the so-called basket can include the price of goods such as food, cars, furniture and apparel, as well as the price of services such as rent, medical costs and recreational spending.
So let's talk about CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Like during my research, I found that this is the way inflation is measured across many countries.
Yeah, let me just caveat that by saying each country constructs their own CPI basket. So what is in it is a function of that.
As you guys can see, sometimes I explain things a little bit funny in the video, but yes, every country has different CPI numbers.
Country's policymakers. Essentially what you want to have is a basket that just reflects people's spending habits, monthly spending habits. And so what you put in it is supposed to be a reflection of what a consumer would typically spend on a month-to-month basis.
Economists then take the cost of this basket, divide it by the cost of the basket from the year or quarter they're comparing it to, then multiply it by 100. This formula calculates the inflation rates we see in headlines. This is known as headline inflation. But many argue that something called core inflation is the more valuable metric to follow.
What economists try to do is they try to smooth out and remove any of the subcomponents that would be extremely volatile on a month-to-month basis or have no ultimate reflection on the strength of the economy. Oil, for example.
Yes.
On any given month, you can have oil moving up and down because of factors that are exogenous to how an economy is operating. So what economists will do is say, well, we'll look at the headline number to get a feel for how at an aggregate level price levels are doing. But then if we want to get an idea for the overall trend of prices, then we're going to strip out some of those volatile components, and that will give us a better measure of how these inflation numbers are panning out.
Now that we understand what inflation is and why it happens, let's explore if it's something we should worry about. Ultimately, do you think it's a good thing or?
A little bit of inflation is good. A lot of inflation is bad, because in the previous video I've mentioned about hyperinflation, and hyperinflation is horrible. It is horrible. So having a little bit of inflation, it encourages people to invest, because otherwise without it, people could just sit on cash. So you want to encourage people to invest their money, and to get that money out there, putting on some risk on assets. It encourages tech, it encourages cryptocurrencies. With no inflation, I mean, the world would pretty much be boring. You wouldn't see too much innovation. You see innovation here and there, but investors aren't going to be as risk on because debt is not cheap. I'm kind of getting a little bit out there, but inflation is a little bit of inflation is good. A lot of inflation is bad. And every year, a Federal Reserve of that country is going to usually have a target for like their target inflation. And a lot of years they're underneath that target. So year on year, you're going to see them hit that target or be a little bit below. Every once in a while, you go way above or a little bit above that target inflation rate. But let's see her opinion, because she has the degrees and I just read a lot. So let's see her opinion on it.
Or a bad thing?
Well, I think economists have come around to the view that a little bit of inflation is good. It's like Goldilocks. You don't
Bada boom, bada bing, baby. You don't always need the degree. Sometimes all you gotta do is read a little book, read a few articles, consult with a couple of economists, and you'll be all right. Because really the information is out there. So anyways, yeah, a little bit of inflation is good, my friends.
You don't want it to be too hot. You don't want it to be too cold. You want it to be somewhere in the middle. Usually inflation is a sign of a well-functioning, productive, and a growing economy. But when you talk about hyperinflation, there we're entering into a completely different stratosphere.
Hyperinflation is when prices spiral out of control, with an inflation rate typically increasing by more than 50% per month.
You don't want that. You don't want it. I'm telling you, you don't want it. It means the economy is doing good, but the only people who benefit from heavy inflation are investors. You're gonna see these asset prices, go ridiculously. You're gonna see the GDP go ridiculously. And it looks good, but your average citizen does not hold assets. So people who don't hold assets aren't going to, benefit from it. And it's really going to lead to a lot crazier evaluation of your currency, to where people can't even purchase things with your currency, as viewed in the previous video with Turkey. Venezuela. I mean, a lot of countries, I think Zimbabwe, a lot of countries struggle with inflation. Like, hyperinflation is not good. Now, if you're purchasing assets, hyperinflation is great. You're going to make a ton of money. You can turn a little bit of money into a crazy amount of money. The only thing that also kind of sucks about it is the exchange rate, because you're making money on the asset, but then the currency is also being devalued. So, I mean, if you don't mind holding the currency in that, holding the value of the assets in that currency, it's not horrible. But anyways, let's see what they say in the rest of the video.
Though many things can trigger hyperinflation, it's most commonly caused by excessive money supply and a loss of confidence in the economy or monetary system. Take Brazil, for example. From 1980 to 1995, the price level increased by a factor of 1 trillion, meaning you would have to pay 1 trillion reais for something that cost you just 15 years ago.
In the case of the Weimar Republic in Germany, for example, post-World War I, they were experiencing inflation, average inflation of about 300 percentage points per month. These are numbers that are actually so high it is difficult to comprehend. At one point, the Reichsbank, the German central bank at the time, actually issued a 100 trillion mark note.
Are you kidding me?
No. I mean, it was extremely painful for many of the people.
And that's why you don't want hyperinflation, my brothers and my sisters. You don't want it. You do not. Well, you don't want hyperinflation. I don't know if I said hyperinflation or inflation, but you don't want it. Because the money always becomes worthless. Like, the money is not even worth the paper that it's printed on. And you end up getting like these $1 million notes, or these $500 million notes, and people will be like, oh, I'm worth $10 billion, but $10 billion isn't even worth anything. So, that's why economics is so interesting, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous, man. So it's not dangerous. Like, I don't want you to be afraid, but it's just, some countries just go through some weird things where it's like the leadership is not there, or the leadership may not understand economics, or they might just be getting wealthy on the economics and their people are suffering.
Who witnessed and lived through that time. There are loads of these images from the 20s of little kids using stockpiles of cash as Lego because cash was worthless.
But inflation doesn't need to spill over into hyperinflation territory to cause trouble. In the 1970s, many of the world's developed economies witnessed double-digit inflation, but it was how the chair of the U.S.'s central bank handled it that made the history books.
Essentially what happened is you had a couple of supply shocks. So we talked about cost push. One of them was an energy supply shock. You had that around.
So this is pretty much my intake on where we will lead into through the 2020s and the 2030s. I'm not certain how bad our inflation is actually going to be, but I believe we will go into stagflationary markets where GDP is going down and inflation is continuing to rise, because we have so many things that are going on in this country right now. Not in only this country, because I'm in Canada, but I mean the US. So you have things with Russia and Ukraine going on right now. I don't know when you're watching this video, maybe they started a war. Maybe. Alrighty. The recording software failed on me. But anyways, um, yeah, you have a lot of things that are going on. So let's say with stagflationary markets, what happens is gross domestic product (GDP) is going down. So it's less people spending money, but inflation is continuing to rise. And that is bad because what happens is people have less money, but commodity prices are still continuing to rise. And that happened in the 70s and 80s, mostly in the 70s. And it wasn't caused specifically in the 70s and 80s, but it was caused in the 60s. And, we had there was you had the baby boomers. And what happened with the baby boomers is you had, people being able to buy houses, take on debt cheaply, and all this stuff. But all it did was cause for inflation to skyrocket. So that's why in the 70s, I would say more so like the late 70s, like early 80s, you saw interest rates, were ridiculous. I think at one point it was like 20% interest rates. So it almost made it didn't, I wouldn't, not to say it didn't make sense to invest in stocks, but people were more so investing in bonds because you were getting crazy coupons on those bonds. But anyways, let's see what they say in the video, and we'll, continue to debate back and forth.
Around 1973, 1974 with the oil embargo, and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So that led to skyrocketing oil prices. At the same time, you had a couple of other things going on back in the US. So President Nixon had pulled the US out of Bretton Woods. He had removed some price controls on certain goods in the food space. So all of these things contributed to a slow and steady rise in inflation until then. We talked about secondary effects. It led to a wage spiral. So workers started demanding an increase in pay. And at one point, we had inflation reach about 14%, and this was around 1980. And the then Fed chair, Paul Volcker, came in and said, okay, well, inflation is the enemy. We have got to cure this. And the only way you can cure this is by hiking interest rates. So he kept hiking and hiking and hiking. The Fed started this interest rate hiking cycle, at which interest rates in the US reached 20 percentage points. Eventually, they managed to start taming inflation, and inflation went down to 3 percentage points by the mid-80s. But, Timo, it came at a very heavy cost because you had more than 4 million Americans unemployed at the time.
And that's why it's constantly having to be balanced, because even though inflation is bad, when you're hiking interest rates, it's not encouraging investors or new entrepreneurs as much, because the economy is going to be bad. Usually when you're hiking interest rates, you're we'll just say stimulating, but you're stimulating a recession, or you're encouraging a recession. Now it does help with inflation. It helps get prices back to reasonable, but it's like at what cost, So it's just weird how this thing works. It's so interesting. And if you agree with me, please comment below. But I mean, it is so interesting to me how economics work and how it affects markets and how we can profit from it. Either way, you can make money going up, down, sideways, or you can even go, it's not even trading stocks and options or forex and futures. But when you do you start trading bonds more often. So, for people in my lifetime, I can't remember what the theory is, but people in my lifetime, I was born in 92. I mean, we've had record low interest rates. So, I mean, everybody's trading stocks. But if you were born in 1970, yeah, I would say in 1960, 1970, and you're starting to invest in trading in the 70s and 80s, you're most likely not even going to really trade stocks that much. You're mostly probably traded bonds, or you maybe traded currencies. But anyways, let's see, almost done with the video. Let's see what they say, and we'll jump into what we want to look at next.
And it basically led to an economic recession in the US. So that was the trade-off that they had to make. In order to keep inflation tame, or to bring it back to tame levels, the economy had to go through a very painful adjustment period. And that is the reason why in this day and age, nobody wants to go back to what happened in the 70s and then the painful trade-offs that ensued afterwards.
What are the changes have we seen countries make to ensure that we don't see a repeat of what we saw in the 70s?
Well, I think one of the most important developments is that you have institutions now, you have central banks whose primary or one of the main mandates is to keep an eye on overall price levels in the system. So many developed market or many central banks out there, their number one goal is to ensure that inflation doesn't get above a certain level. The magic number is around 2% for advanced economy central banks. They'll say somewhere around there because it's not too high so that it will start causing secondary effects, but not too low or close to zero or even negative that we may be dangerously close to that deflation or disinflationary dynamics also, which central banks want to avoid. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
You're great.
All right, guys. So, man, I hate when that happens. Anyways, yeah, guys. So that's CNBC's international take on inflation. Now, it's not the hardest concept, but it is something like very important that you want to know when you're trading markets, because as you can see, inflation can encourage recessions or it can encourage asset prices to be ridiculous, as we've seen within recent years. You know, actually, I'm going to even go somewhere further. You know what? No, we're not going to go into that. We're not going to go into that. We'll say that for another video because we got to create that content, baby. Yeah, so inflation can be good. It can be bad. You know, Fed's raising interest rates can be good. Yeah, it can be good or it can be bad. It does lead to recession. So majority of the recessions that you see, maybe a couple months beforehand, or even maybe once the Fed just like started mentioning raising interest rates, you start to see that a couple months later, or maybe a year later, that we ended up being in a recession. And it's, you know, people get adjustable rate mortgages, and as rates start to rise, those payments on those mortgages start to rise as well, and people can't make that. You know what I mean? Like, so, you know, you want to get those fixed rate mortgages. But anyways, that's it for the day. Well, not really for the day, but that's it for this video. And then we're going to make another video. So anyways, guys, I'll see you guys soon. Peace.
Man, even Jesus had a shooter. And God be having unbelievers that didn't mess up their demeanor. And yes, they know it's hard, they know, cause when they be up in those trenches, man, they show out. But what they do